Chapter 19, God and Mammon, Economics, Part 4. Digging down to the roots. Money is the root of all evil. This quote, taken as a fragment of a sentence from the Authorized King James Bible, has been influencing the way that godly men and women have approached the topic of economics for the last 400 years. Unfortunately, this pithy quote removes the first qualifying phrase, the love of, and glosses over several other distinctions that could have eased the weary consciences of people struggling to balance the needs of everyday life with the fear of eternal punishment. In fact, the original readers would never think money was the root of all evil, because that whole English phrase, love of money, is a single word in Greek, philargyria, an unusual term found only in this one verse, 1 Timothy 6:10. This unique word comes from a letter written to Timothy, a younger man who is in charge of the growing church in Ephesus by his mentor Paul, and it was meant as warning to those who might see an opportunity to get rich through their involvement with the church. While the overall message is important for everyone, the warning was especially meant to those seeking the opportunity to teach and the leaders in charge of managing those opportunities. Extreme reactions to this teaching have ranged from monks taking vows of poverty to attempts at living in communities free of the influence of currency. And none of these solutions have proven durable in the long term, and many of them have had disastrous consequences for the people trying to live by them, or for those being forced to live by them. Various translations since then have attempted to clarify what is being said here. Some distinctions made are that money is not the root, but a root, ESV, CSB, LEB, and others. Another is that this love of money is a root not of all evil, but all kinds of evil, ESV, LSB, NIV, and others. The Amplified Version attempts to give the fullest possible meaning of the Greek words by bracketing concepts that are lost in a word-for-word translation. Here, they try to convey a fuller explanation of what the term translated love of money means. For the love of money, that is, the greedy desire for it and the willingness to gain it unethically, is a root of all sorts of evil. The New Life Version is an interesting translation designed for people with a limited knowledge of English. The simplified vocabulary does not have a separate term for evil, so it is sometimes translated as bad, or in this case, as sin. The love of money is the beginning of all kinds of sin. This wording brings the problem a lot closer to the ground. Instead of thinking about money like an evil spirit out to get us, you can think of how Judas' habit of skimming off the top of the money bag led him down a path to the ultimate betrayal. Some of the older translations point to another distinction. It's not love of money, but something else. The Geneva Bible provides what seems like a much better word for helping us grasp the heart of the problem. For the desire of money is the root of all evil. Desire is all about wanting more and more, and that's where the problem with money usually begins. Love is a good thing. It's one of the characteristics of God. But when you love something in an unhealthy way, it isn't really love. After all, if we use the Bible's own terminology, love is described as patient and kind, and it does not rejoice in wrongdoing. 1 Corinthians 13. Desire would have us spend, steal, or hoard as much money as we can get our hands on. But to love it would be to make it as useful for doing good and as useless for doing bad as any tool or thing can be. Our experience shows us that money is not an evil thing, but a tool. And like most tools, it can be used both for evil and for good. Many people with little money still participate in all kinds of evil, and there are many people who successfully avoid all kinds of destructive vices at all the various levels of economic success. But despite such examples, as exceptions or rules, money affects us all. And both the type of money we use and the way our society uses and views it has an impact on our lives. Most people who study the history of economics and the development and implementation of various economic theories will recognize that some sort of capitalist economy works best in providing goods and services and making them widely available to a general population. The communist ideal is no antidote to the economic shortcomings we face in our current day, and it won't be a feasible solution until the selfish nature of human beings is eliminated. So let's get those notions off the table. There are some wonderful advantages to the system of economics we currently have in place. But like anything else made by humans, it's not a perfect system capable of running itself. We need to be intentional with how we interact with money. If we depend on our current economy to help us secure the kind of future we truly want for our kids, the odds are stacked against us. This is going to be the kind of chapter that will need to be expanded in the future, and the long-term overhaul of economic systems is a project for someone with greater insight and knowledge of the forces and mechanisms that make our economies work. However, we can approach the current economic environment as another sort of wilderness, one we can discover ways to adapt to until it can be transformed into something better. First, let's talk about money, what it is and how we use it. As we mentioned, it's not an evil in and of itself, but actually a very useful tool, and one that has facilitated a lot of good. Money is a symbol, one of the most universal. It's a symbolic store of value and can be used as a functional representation of almost anything made of physical matter, time, and energy. When considering the categories of basic necessities described in the parable of the sheep and the goats, money can provide at least some solution for each of them. Symbolic function, food and drink. Functional representation, money. Symbolic function, clothing. Functional representation, money. Shelter, symbolic function, shelter. Functional representation, money. Symbolic function, belonging and companionship. Functional representation, money. Symbolic function, comfort or release from prison. Functional representation, money. Money was historically made of things that were rare and valuable. Depending on the culture and environment, it could be something like salt, still used as a form of money by some nomads. It was widely used in the Roman Empire, and its Latin name, salarium, is the root of our modern salary. Like Ford Prefect's multi-purpose towel, something like salt can be a symbol representing a day's wages or a basket of goods, but it is also the thing itself, mineral salt, useful for cooking and preserving foods. The trade-offs of having something consumable like salt as a form of currency can start cropping up fairly quickly. People have to decide to use it now or save it to make larger purchases. Supply and demand can make the price skyrocket, which is great for the person who's been hoarding it, but terrible for someone trying to preserve a half a cow for later consumption. Silver and gold. This led to people to start using items with less functional utility as currency instead. For a very long time, gold and silver acted as excellent stores of value. There was no temptation to eat your coins when you were starving. You could hold a lot of value in a small package, and it was hard to make fakes. They still had a value in and of themselves in their beauty, and were sought after as luxury materials for jewelry. Wearing jewelry then became a dual symbol of status, signifying societal rank and an indication of wealth. While not as easily spent as coinage, an earring or a bracelet could always provide emergency access to food, shelter, clothing, and transportation in a pinch. By whose authority? While gold and silver worked for thousands of years as universal symbols of wealth, paper money took symbolic value to another level. As it was a representation of an amount of gold or silver that could be stored in a bank, no one would be tempted to use the paper for whatever utility function it had. The issuance of such symbolic representation was once a highly regulated affair, with serial numbers and ledgers used to maintain correspondence between the paper notes out in the world and the precious metals stored in the bank. This rigor was used to reduce the temptation to produce counterfeits. Someone might be able to use fake cash to make purchases, but once the business deposited the money in the bank, they would be found out. The consequences of being found guilty might be enough to keep you and I from attempting such a scheme. But who could go check to make sure the banks and governments really had the gold and silver they claim to hold? This ultimately led to realization by governments and banks that they could simply print money by fiat on their own authority. Such systems were entirely dependent on the strength and integrity of the governments and banks issuing the currency. While these schemes were sometimes successful when first introduced, they eventually led to disaster as the money became devalued by overprinting. New heaps of cash could be printed and used to make purchases, but once people realized that the creation of this new money did not increase the amount of food, clothing, or real estate within their nation, the prices for all these things skyrocketed and continued to climb until the printers stopped printing money. Our current system is based on this same fiat design, with a few more checks and balances, and some regulatory systems designed to keep things from spinning out of control. In reality, our system is based on debt. When new money is printed and given to the government to spend, it is done with a promise that we will pay it back later. This has led to a majority debt-based economy in general, with most people owing money on their homes, cars, and education, as well as an enormous amount of credit card debt with predatory interest rates. Many people are forced to use credit cards not only for any unseen emergencies, but for the basic necessities of everyday life. Widespread debt was introduced as a means of procuring steady labor from workers. Henry Ford would sell his workers new cars with a lengthy loan that could be paid back in small installments. With his employees now indebted to him to maintain a lifestyle, he could worry less about factory conditions and turnover. The elimination of competition in the form of independent shops and cottage industries meant that his financial future was very well secured. There are already a lot of books on how to wisely avoid the financial pitfalls of debt and turn this system to work for you instead of against you through various forms of investment. They aim to get you on the plus side of the equation that profits off inflation. But almost all of those guides miss a few crucial components of how to build a truly resilient shelter in this economic wilderness. It goes back to the symbolic nature of our money and why so many of those Bible translators thought it was a source of evil. Our current economic system is the first truly symbolic one, as even cash has become virtually obsolete, and our wealth is simply represented by a number on a screen. When hyperinflation hit Zimbabwe, at least the worthless cash still had the utility of a piece of paper. You could use it to line a pet cage, blow your nose, or burn it. Dollar signs and symbols. The universality of currency has made it seem like a thing in and of itself, and viewing it as such is certainly one of the paths that leads to all sorts of evils. The fact that we all use the same money is also deceptive because it makes us seem like we are all participating in the same economy. But this isn't truly the case. One complaint you will hear often is about what our tax dollars are being spent on. And while misappropriations of government funds are directed towards many foolish endeavors, different people will be outraged about tax dollars being spent on completely contradictory things. People value things differently, yet our system of currency reduces everything to a monetary price. This has many negative consequences that without critical analysis, we will completely miss. Consider first how young people approach education and career choices. Our economic system ranks careers on their monetary earning potential. Many careers rely on a candidate being born with an outstanding set of characteristics, such as athletes, actors, and musicians. These types of jobs actually function in dual economic roles, as they receive high income from their jobs, but also have access to valuable endorsement deals with advertisers and all the benefits of fame and glory. This last bit is an important aspect that we will come back to. The high value of these extremely rare jobs causes people to pursue them long past the point when they should be turning in another direction. For some, it's a high risk, high reward proposition that may or may not pay off. For many others, it's an impossibility they just haven't realized yet. Next down from these types of jobs are the ones designed to reward pure industriousness and creativity. Careers in finance have become highly sought after because they represent some of the highest potential earnings. This represents a slightly lower risk for most people, but many people ill-suited towards these careers will still gravitate towards them because of the high potential earnings. Depending on when they pivot, it may lead to many unhappy consequences. Other high reward jobs in technology industries are also subject to drawing people ill-suited to the task. Whether they end up in a different field or simply languishing in obscurity amongst the ranks of middle managers, we don't notice the percentage of unhappy people, only the success stories. But perhaps the most widespread assumption that has come out of this economic system is that everyone must pursue at least a bachelor's degree to get a real job and make a decent living. In recent years, 60% of young men have declined to take this offer because its promises have failed to bear fruit in the real world, but they don't necessarily have anything better to do. An 18-year-old high school graduate can easily gain access to $200,000 plus of student loans and is expected to do so, although they have no idea what value college will provide to them or how to pursue the goal of a career. Students will graduate with bachelor's degrees before their brains have finished developing. They could be halfway through a graduate program by the time they do, saddled with even greater debt, and still not be able to find a good job. Yet no one is willing to give high school graduates access to such loans for the sake of housing, investment, or starting a business. The only reliable option that a high school graduate has available to improving his economic future is pursuing a college education through government-backed loan assistance. Next, we should consider the consequences of those who do succeed. Perhaps someone graduates at the top of their class and has options available to pursue a career. Certain fields necessitate moving to particular locations. If you are pursuing a job in technology, you may have to move to a particular city. Once again, many people may need to risk taking a lower paying position in a company for the potential payoff of greater upward mobility. But if they fail to succeed wildly, they may find themselves in a precarious financial situation. Here is a simple table comparing income and pricing from two centers of industry, Boston, Massachusetts, and San Francisco, California, with Irmo, South Carolina, a city that my father-in-law moved to based on a Google search looking for a good balance of affordable housing and low taxes. As you can see, the ratios between income and housing costs are drastically different. Even if someone makes 10% or 20% more than the median income in Boston or San Francisco, the inflated cost of living means they will be struggling to find suitable housing for an individual, let alone a place large enough to start a family, with a small 1,000-foot house costing nearly $1 million. On the other hand, even someone making less than the median, perhaps because they don't have a degree, can afford to save enough money to make a significant down payment on a modest home within a few years in Irmo. The $503 needed to make the average student loan payment could be saved to make a 10% down payment on a 1,000 square foot home in Irmo in just over 2 years, and the remaining mortgage payment at even a 9% interest is still less than $1,000 a month. A young married couple can live together for half the price while potentially doubling their income, and mom can afford to quit working when they have kids or still contribute significantly towards expenses and saving while only working part-time. This is not a pitch for rural versus urban living, but at the moment, young people from these smaller communities are leaving them to move to cities in droves. If nothing happens to reverse this trend, the cost of maintaining infrastructure will go up in these small towns, and the aging population will slowly vanish. These small and medium towns will be reclaimed by the wilderness, but an influx of new residents can reverse the trend far more affordably than starting over from scratch. There are definitely trade offs to making such a move. It's not as easy to meet people in small towns, nor are there going to be as many job opportunities. But sometimes there's an advantage to bucking a trend. You take yourself out of a very competitive game and give yourself a big advantage. The monetary reward is not as high, but the chance at a full and meaningful life may be far greater. Price versus value. This leads to the next problem largely ignored by our economic system. Monetary prices are not always good indicators of lasting value. There's a growing crowd of people who are searching for spouses and trying to have children after postponing such pursuits in favor of securing the economic rewards of a career. If you poll those who find it, they will almost unanimously tell you that the rewards of marriage and family far outstrip the benefit of simply having a larger number in their bank account. If you ask those who are unable to find a spouse or have children, they will probably tell you the same thing even more emphatically. But it's not just marriage and family that suffer, but the whole way of life. The entire package of disintegrated needs and desires are driven by the economic system that only values the bottom line. The social media landscape, the influencer culture, the fandoms and LARPs, all are driven by people throwing money in an attempt to replicate what was readily available to every citizen of a small town a century ago. Don't mistake me, the system is still the best we have, but it only has one means of expressing value. Higher is better than lower. More is better than less. It's blind to the effects of replacing 1,000 cottage industries with a single corporation other than a company bottom line or a national GDP. This means that we each have to determine what we most want out of life and seek the best way to find it, and it may be in opposition to feeding that bottom line. The universal symbolic nature of our currency blinds us to another important fact. The symbolic reduction of all goods and services is only one half of the equation. That is the supply side. On the other side is a symbolic reduction of all demands into a monetary value. To unpack this, we need to re-examine Paul's words to Timothy and remember that they lived in a time when money was more than just a number on a screen. The universal nature of desire. Remember that silver was the form of currency in use when Paul wrote about the love of money to Timothy. Because unlike a pile of salt, precious metals were a form of money that could bear images of authority and enhance the image of the wearer. Wealth could make one beautiful, making the wearer an object of desire, and sparking the ambition of those who desired the adoration of others. As silver and gold were synonymous with the term money up until only a few hundred years ago, perhaps translators thought the message was quite clear. But one of the oldest translations of the Bible gives us a unique insight by recognizing the function of the Greek word philargria, not translating it so literally into its constituent elements, philos, friendly, fondness, brotherly love, and argyros, shining, as in silver coins, but instead discerning the meaning of the word as it affects our human behavior. An updated version of John Wycliffe's Old English translation of 1382 puts it this way: "For the root of all evils is covetousness, which some men, coveting, erred from the faith, and beset them with many sorrows. Love or desire for money here becomes covetousness, because covetousness is always a desire for what is not ours. It affects us regardless of how successful we are in gaining the objects of our desire. The poorest person in the world could be the most covetous. It is the opposite of contentment, satisfaction with what we have. It's an inner attitude that others cannot see except in our continuous behavior over a long period of time. It's such a basic element of how we operate, we don't realize how often we do it. Paul wrote about his own experience of recognizing his covetous desire when writing to the community in Rome. I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, "You shall not covet." But sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. For apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin came alive and I died. The very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. For sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me and through it killed me. Romans 7:7-11. Paul is describing the phenomenon that occurs when we become aware of another person's desire. In this case, he is referring to the last of the 10 Commandments. As Paul reads through the first 9, he believes that he has kept them well. He has not worshipped other gods, crafted any idols, misused the name of God. He's kept the Sabbath, honored his parents, and he has refrained from murder, adultery, theft, and bearing false witness. Yet when he gets to the final commandment, this is what he reads: "And you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and you shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, or his male servant, or his female servant, his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's." Deuteronomy 5:21. The simple act of reading these words and truly thinking about them has a profound effect. He thinks about his neighbor's wife and his house, field, servants, animals, and anything else. But he is now realizing that these are objects of desire. The command not to covet causes him to view these things differently, and in doing so, he sees the desirability of possessing them for himself, and so begins to covet. This phenomenon was articulated by the philosopher René Girard, who labeled it mimetic desire and formed the foundation of his theory. Man is the creature who does not know what to desire, and he turns to others in order to make up his mind. We desire what others desire because we imitate their desires. If anyone has watched small children playing with toys, they will have likely seen a vivid example of this. There may be a room filled with toys, but as soon as one child picks up any particular toy and begins to play with it, that toy becomes the only one the other child is interested in. Everything else disappears, and they will resort to stealing, violence, shouting, crying, and lying to have it for themselves. This foolish reaction quickly passes, but what happens in the moment is startling to see. When Paul realized the effect of coveting, he says, "It killed me." And in writing his letter to Timothy, he says that among sinners, he is the foremost, something that seems odd for someone who spent most of his life trying to study and follow God's commands. Yet if this seems extreme, it's because we haven't unpacked the full implications of what is being said and realized at this moment. Just as money is a symbolic placeholder for physical goods and services, covetousness is a symbolic placeholder for every other type of evil. Just as our verse first said, the love of money, covetousness, is the root of all evil, Jesus pointed this out in his Sermon on the Mount when he equated anger with murder and lust with adultery. You have heard it said that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Matthew 5:21 through 22, and 27 through 28. Critics of Jesus have accused him of adding to the law and holding people to a higher standard than God did. But the implications of the commandment against covetousness lead directly to the conclusion Jesus points out. Just as money can be used as a symbolic representation of any particular thing, an economic system can translate the desire for that thing into a monetary value. The cost of covetousness. The basic law of economics is supply and demand, but introducing covetousness into this economic system can drive the system haywire. Scarcity drives prices up. When salt is in short supply, the salt in your storehouse becomes more valuable. Supplies can be influenced both naturally and artificially, but when mimetic desire turns to covetousness, things can go haywire. As an example, let's say there's a village with 50 farmers looking to buy a cow. The price will vary greatly depending on the supply, the desire of the seller to make money, and the desire of the farmers to buy cows. When he has more cows than they need, the seller can't make much profit. He's going to have to sell cows at the minimum price, and he's going to have to give the farmers his best stock. If the supply and demand are equal, both parties should be happy. If the supply is low, the seller can charge more and more easily sell cows of a lesser value. This is Economics 101. But let's say there is one neighbor who already has a cow, and the other 50 farmers decide that's the only cow they are interested in. If everyone is starving and the cow is a good milker, the neighbor would not be interested in any price. The cow is irreplaceable. In such a situation, the cow will go not to the person willing to pay the most, but the one most willing to commit dastardly deeds. Many men would be tempted to steal the cow, and some would resort to murder. Knowing that possessing the cow would put the same target on their own head, the men would seek alliances or full-fledged collusion. It's hard to imagine a scenario other than a dead farmer and a 50-man barbecue, the act that transforms a village of farmers into a horde of barbarians. The dire circumstances of famine and potential starvation illustrate the plausibility of such a scenario, and such tragedies have occurred many times in our history. But it's important to recognize that mimetic desire does not always lead to covetousness. There is a difference. In a situation where cows are in ample supply, it's still the purchase of the first cow by the neighbor that drives the other farms to want one. But they are happy to have a cow of their own. It doesn't need to be their neighbor's cow. But what if it's not the have-nots who are coveting their neighbor's livestock, but the ones who already have the most? The sad truth is, very often this is the case. There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. 2 Samuel 12, 1 through 4. This story was told by the prophet Nathan to King David, who was understandably outraged at the injustice done to this poor man. When he spoke of the justice he wanted to inflict upon the perpetrator, the prophet told him, "You are the man." David had not, in fact, had a lamb killed, but an innocent man, one of his loyal soldiers, and he had done so after impregnating the man's wife. Murder followed adultery, but the first step was in David seeing the woman, and rather than averting his eyes at the sight of something he could not own, he sent his servants to fetch her for him. Our neighbor's wife is the first thing we are told not to covet. Of all the things we could stand to lose, nothing affects someone more. Marriage is the most important symbol in the Bible. It's the center of the whole economic plan and the strongest analogy for our relationship with God. To worship other gods is to commit spiritual idolatry, but adultery is always preceded by desire. Elite privilege. The privilege of wealthy men to attract women is often the desire above all others that fuels the ambition of wealthy men, especially those prone to corruption. It was in a moment when David was relishing his privilege as king that his downfall began, as he stayed back while his men went to war. But just as the desire for another man's wife led to adultery and murder, ill-gotten gain fuels desire rather than satisfying it. This has resulted in many despotic practices over the millennia. The belief of some that they represent an elite has caused them to take from the lower classes at will. The first method of elite superiority was the most straightforward. The strong man takes what he wants by force. But over time, as technology and the development of language and philosophy advanced, other forms of elite citizenry emerged. The democracy of Athens was not a system where anyone could vote, but only the citizens, those men, only men, who resided in the city and owned property, usually inherited by someone who took it by force. The philosophers crafted theories of government that centered around an intellectual elite to make decisions for the masses. Religion was often used as a signifier of the elite, as the Caesars claimed to be descended from the gods, and later Christian monarchs claimed their authority via the divine right of kings. The greatest faction has been the economic elite, who could even deny the will of kings, and without whom the king's armies would not be fed or paid. Such practices still exist in many countries today, and often a combination of various techniques. The caste system of India is one example of religious and ethnic elitism. Within the powerful business conglomerates of South Korea, known as chaebols, a strict hierarchy creates a series of elite classes. The highest tiers are based on the hereditary of founding families, while for most Koreans, their entire future is determined by the score they achieve on a single test. The examination is followed by mass suicides each year by those who do not achieve a sufficient score. In many third world countries, predatory businesses rent tools to their workers, as well as means of transportation, clothes, and housing. The wages earned on paper might be fair and substantial, but the exorbitant costs deducted for these necessities often leave barely enough for food. Getting sick or injured means not eating, and so many workers will continue to work in dangerous professions, drastically shortening the length and quality of their lives. If any unforeseen needs arise, often the only recourse is to take a loan from their employer. The minuscule amount garnished from their earnings to repay such a loan means that a single trip to the hospital could take years to pay off, or require the children of the worker to help pay it off, usually by working for their parents' employer at extremely young ages. There is no explanation for these practices that cause poor performance and yield inferior results, except that the owners of such businesses view themselves as an elite and covet the time, energy, and resources of the people they deem second class. Despite this, many of the workers are in many ways more happy and joyful than the average American. Mental health issues are rare, and people in such situations are remarkably generous with others in their community, despite how little they have to share. It's a testimony to the fact that for humans, the transformative act of work itself is necessary for a happy life. While our economy is not likely to resort to that level of physical despotism anytime soon, the ever-growing bureaucratic institutions and technocratic corporatization of our economy are replicating the same system on higher levels as we speak. There is a real-life conspiracy against the individual ownership of productive property. The United Nations and their allies at the World Economic Forum, WEF, have been breaking every aspect of the 10th commandment, basically coveting the whole world. This was summarized in the statement, "You'll own nothing and be happy," first released in a 2016 video from the WEF. It was ostensibly derived from an essay written as a scenario showing where we could be heading, for better and for worse. But the video clearly portrayed it as unequivocally good. The article, originally titled, "Welcome to 2030, I Own Nothing, Have No Privacy, and Life Has Never Been Better," is an advertisement for a dream called the circular economy, where all goods are turned into services. Since peasants and laborers in the direst of circumstances can be happy in third world countries, it's likely that people would be able to discover a way to be happy in the circular economy as well. But it won't have anything to do with their lack of privacy or property. A circular economy sounds remarkably similar to the closed circle of the serpent, an idea totally contrary to the Bible's vision of a world that is fruitful, multiplies, and fills the earth. Footnote: this idea comes from the book Meditations on the Tarot, a journey into Christian Hermeticism, attributed to Anonymous but written by Valentin Tomberg. It instead reduces the earth to what can be known and then reduces everything inside the circle to its constituent parts. Ultimately, the only thing a closed circle contains is death. Nevertheless, the moves towards these goals have long been underway and already have a great impact on our lives. The clearest example of this is our banking system. No one owns anything because the costs are too high. We borrow our education in the form of student loans, our transportation through loans or leases, and our houses and apartments in the same way. A new job requires an appropriate wardrobe. A new apartment requires furnishings and household items. Everything can be purchased through microloans and payments stretched over several monthly installments. Each of these items has a monetary value, but due to interest and amortization, the price paid is far higher, and the length it takes to repay that bill keeps people tethered to jobs that provide a certain level of income, restricting people's ability to move, marry, and have kids. While the costs of buying some tools and establishing a basic side hustle are still quite low, the barriers establishing a proper business are becoming higher and higher. The more technical skilled trades have long required a more in-depth process of licensing and permitting than handyman jobs, but the increasing requirements and regulations being imposed on small businesses through legislation, like the Corporate Transparency Act, make it increasingly difficult to start a business and will likely cause many others to close. Those who work in the urban environments and the more technological and corporate domains are increasingly subject to similar arrangements as the miners and farmers in third world countries. Although the quality and quantity of consumables are far higher, many of the tools needed to perform their jobs are the property of their employers. Hardware and software often needed for work are now moving towards subscription-based models, as are many consumer goods and services. This gives giant corporations predictable streams of revenue, and which allows for continuous influence on the legislature in both the laws passed and their bureaucratic appointments. A revolving door of the same characters passing from government to financial to corporate positions has produced what looks very much like a circle closing in all around us. What allowed these circumstances? How did the American dream shift from the cabin on the edge of the frontier with a small army of kids to a little house with a white picket fence to a closed box whose only light comes from a screen? Why are we heading towards a circular economy with no property or privacy? And how did the dreams of our children change from becoming presidents and astronauts to social media influencers? Every step along the path was taken by breaking the 10th commandment.